New Mexico, August 1944. The desert sun burned white-hot over Camp Lordsburg, turning the air into something you could almost see, thick and shimmering like waves on glass. In the mess hall's corner, 12 German women prisoners sat at a long wooden table, hands folded, eyes downcast, waiting for whatever minimal rations their captivity would allow. They had eaten nothing but bread and thin soup for 3 days during transport from the processing center. Then an American cook named Betty Morrison appeared carrying a tray that held something impossible. Fresh-baked brownies still warm from the oven, and tall glasses of chocolate milk beaded with condensation. What happened next would crack open every belief propaganda had built about American weakness and scarcity. The 12 women had been captured in Italy during the Allied advance through the peninsula, taken prisoner when hospital units were overrun by forces pushing north. They were nurses, administrators, radio operators women who had served the regime's military apparatus in roles that kept them close to combat, but not quite in it. The journey to America had been long and disorienting. From Italy to North Africa, by truck from North Africa, across the Atlantic in cargo ship holds where the air tasted of salt and diesel and fear. From the eastern ports to New Mexico, by train that rattled through landscapes too vast to comprehend. They had been moving for 6 weeks, processed through detention centers, documented and photographed, and assigned numbers that would define them for the duration of their captivity. Camp Lordsburg sat in the New Mexican desert like an island in an ocean of sand and scrub brush. Wire fences stretched in perfect geometric patterns. Guard towers rose at intervals, silhouettes against skies so blue it hurt to see. Barracks buildings stood in rows, wooden structures that radiated heat during the day and released it slowly through desert nights that turned suddenly impossibly cold. The women arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when the temperature had reached 108 degrees, and even the guards moved slowly, conserving energy against heat that felt almost hostile. They were processed through intake medical examinations, inventory of their meager possessions, assignment to Barrack C, which had been designated for female prisoners. Among the 12 was Greta Hoffman, 34 years old, who had been a surgical nurse in Munich before volunteering for military service. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to authority, someone who had given orders in operating theaters and expected them to be followed. Captivity had not yet broken that bearing, though it had certainly tested it. There was Anna Schmidt, 26, a clerk who had kept supply records with meticulous accuracy, who found comfort in order and systems and the predictability of properly maintained documentation. The chaos of capture and transport had unmoored her from everything that made her feel competent. There was young Liesel Weber, barely 22, a radio operator whose facility with languages had made her valuable to military communications. She spoke English fluently, had studied in London for a semester before the war, and now found herself serving as reluctant translator for women who shared her captivity, but not her linguistic skills. The others ranged in age from 24 to 41, each carrying their own stories of how they had ended up serving the regime, how they had been captured, what they had lost in the process. They were united now by captivity and uncertainty, and the basic human need to survive whatever came next. Camp Lordsburg was a sprawling facility that housed over 3,000 prisoners by late 1944, mostly men separated into compounds based on nationality and rank. The women's section was small by comparison, isolated by additional fencing from the male prisoners, staffed by female guards who viewed their charges with expressions that mixed suspicion and something approaching sympathy. The camp commander, Colonel Frank Harrison, was 56 years old and had fought in the previous war. He ran the facility with efficiency that bordered on bureaucratic obsession, following regulations with precision that left little room for individual judgment. But he had also seen enough of war to recognize that prisoners were people who deserved treatment that met the minimum standards of human decency, even if regulations didn't always demand compassion. The head of the women's section was Lieutenant Dorothy Walsh, 31, a former social worker from Boston, who had volunteered for military service and found herself managing prisoners in a new Mexican desert camp. She approached her duties with pragmatic kindness, recognizing that women who cooperated made her job easier than women who resisted, and that cooperation came more readily when basic needs were met. The first 3 days were difficult. The women were adjusting to new routines, new rules, new realities. They woke at dawn, cleaned their barracks, performed assigned work duties that ranged from laundry to food preparation to camp maintenance. They ate meals in the mess hall at designated times, meals that were basic but adequate: bread, soup, occasional vegetables, meat that appeared less frequently than they would have liked. But the food was not the worst part. The worst part was the uncertainty, the not knowing what came next, or how long captivity would last, or what kind of Germany remained for them to return to eventually. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored, carrying news of destruction and displacement that made their own discomfort seem almost trivial by comparison. Betty Morrison was 43 years old and had been cooking in the camp mess hall for 18 months. She was a widow. Her husband had been lost at Pearl Harbor, and her 3 sons were serving overseas in places she couldn't always locate on maps. She had taken this job partly for patriotic duty and partly because cooking for thousands gave her something to focus on besides worry. Betty approached cooking with the philosophy that food could be medicine for the soul as much as nourishment for the body. She worked within the limitations of military rations and budget constraints, but she also looked for opportunities to make meals more than just fuel. A cake for someone's birthday, extra seasoning when supplies allowed, presentation that made institutional food feel slightly less institutional. She had noticed the German women during their first days in camp. They ate mechanically, without pleasure or conversation, as if food was simply an obligation to fulfill. They reminded her of trauma cases she had read about, people so damaged by their experiences that even basic activities like eating became difficult. Betty understood trauma. She had lived with it since December 1941, since the telegram arrived telling her that her husband's ship had been destroyed and he would not be coming home. She knew how grief and shock could make the world feel distant and food taste like ash. She also knew that small kindnesses sometimes helped, that tiny gestures of normalcy could provide handholds for people trying to climb out of darkness. On the women's 4th day at Camp Lordsburg, Betty made a decision that would have significant consequences. She would bake something special, something that represented American abundance and comfort, and she would share it with these German prisoners who looked like they needed reminding that goodness still existed in the world. Betty's brownies were legendary in the camp. She had refined the recipe over 18 months of trial and error, learning how to work with military-grade chocolate and butter substitutes, figuring out the precise timing that produced brownies with crispy edges and fudgy centers. The prisoners called them Morrison's Magic, and guards would trade favors for an extra piece. On Friday afternoon, when the heat had finally broken enough to make the kitchen tolerable, Betty mixed her batter. Real butter today, which was a luxury that required saving ration coupons. Chocolate melted smooth and dark. Sugar measured precisely. Eggs beaten until they formed ribbons. She poured the batter into pans and slid them into the oven, setting the timer with the precision of someone who knew exactly how long perfection required. The smell began 20 minutes later, drifting through the mess hall and out into the compound. It was a smell that made everyone who encountered it stop and breathe deeply, made them remember homes and holidays and times before the war. Chocolate and butter, and something indefinable that spoke to comfort and safety and being cared for. Lieutenant Walsh found Betty in the kitchen as she was pulling the brownies from the oven. "Those smell amazing," Walsh said. "They're for the new women," Betty replied, cutting the brownies into perfect squares. "The German girls. They look like they could use something sweet. Walsh hesitated. Regulations say prisoners get standard rations. Nothing extra unless it's a holiday or special circumstance. Consider this a special circumstance, Betty said firmly. Those women look like they've been through hell. A brownie isn't going to compromise security or violate any important regulation. It's just a kindness. Walsh considered this. She had been pushing against some of Colonel Harrison's stricter interpretations of regulations, believing that small flexibilities made management easier rather than harder. A brownie fell solidly into the category of harmless kindness. All right, Walsh agreed. But you're serving them yourself. I want to see how they react. While the brownies cooled, Betty prepared chocolate milk, another luxury she had been saving ingredients for. Real milk from local dairy suppliers. Chocolate syrup she made from scratch using cocoa powder and sugar. Ice from the camp's refrigeration system that usually was reserved for medical supplies and officers' quarters. She mixed the chocolate milk in a large pitcher, stirring until the syrup dissolved completely, creating liquid that was dark and rich and looked almost too good to be real. She poured it into tall glasses, added ice that clinked and settled, watched condensation bead on the outside as cold met desert-heated air. The tray, when assembled, looked like something from a different world. 12 brownies on a white platter, 12 glasses of chocolate milk sweating in the afternoon heat, everything arranged with the care Betty brought to all her work. It looked like abundance. It looked like someone cared. It looked like America. Betty carried the tray into the mess hall during the women's designated rest period, when they sat at tables doing very little, waiting for the next work assignment or meal, or whatever structure the day would impose. They looked up when she entered, faces showing confusion at this deviation from routine. Liesel, who spoke English, stood up cautiously. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong," Betty said, setting the tray on their table. "I made these for you, brownies and chocolate milk. Thought you ladies might enjoy something sweet." The women stared at the tray. They stared at Betty. They looked at each other with expressions that mixed suspicion with confusion, with something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been trained out of them by months of captivity and years of war. "I don't understand," Liesel said carefully. "This is ... for us?" "Yes, ma'am. Fresh baked, still warm. The chocolate milk's cold. You should drink it before the ice melts." Greta spoke in German, her voice sharp with suspicion. Liesel translated. "She wants to know what you want from us. What this costs." Betty felt her heart squeeze. These women had been taught to expect cruelty, had learned that kindness always carried hidden costs, couldn't imagine that someone would bake for them simply because they looked like they needed something good. "It doesn't cost anything," Betty said gently. "It's a gift, free, no strings attached. I'm a cook, and cooking for people is what I do. Sometimes that means making something special just because I can." Liesel translated this, and the women engaged in rapid German discussion. Betty caught fragments of tone, if not meaning disbelief, suspicion, hunger warring with caution. Finally, Greta made what appeared to be a decision, and nodded once, sharp and definitive. "We will try," Liesel translated. "But if this is trick, if there is poison, or if you want something from us—" "It's not a trick," Betty interrupted firmly. "And the only thing I want is for you to enjoy some good food. That's all. I promise." Anna Schmidt was the first to reach for a brownie. She was the youngest of the group to have lived through the previous war's aftermath, remembered childhood hunger that propaganda had promised would never return. The brownie was warm in her hand, heavier than she expected, releasing smell that made her mouth water involuntarily. She took a small bite, cautious, testing for poison or spoilage or something wrong that would justify her suspicion. What she got instead was chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz wartime substitute she had grown accustomed to in Germany. She got butter's richness, sugar's pure sweetness, texture that was simultaneously crispy and chewy and somehow perfect. Anna's eyes widened. She took another bite, larger this time, and a sound escaped her throat, not quite a moan, but something close, the involuntary response of someone tasting something extraordinary after months of bland institutional food. The other women watched Anna's reaction and reached for their own brownies. Greta took hers with the careful precision of someone used to surgical instruments. Liesel grabbed hers eagerly, suspicion overcome by Anna's obvious enjoyment. The others followed, and suddenly all 12 women were tasting brownies for the first time. A reaction was unanimous and overwhelming. Faces that had been hard and suspicious softened into expressions of shocked pleasure. Eyes closed as women focused entirely on taste and texture and the experience of eating, something made with care rather than simple efficiency. Some chewed slowly, trying to make the experience last. Others ate quickly, as if afraid the brownies might disappear. But it was the chocolate milk that truly broke them. Liesel picked up a glass of chocolate milk, feeling the cold through condensation-slick glass, seeing ice cubes float in liquid, so dark it was almost black. She had drunk chocolate milk before as a child, before the war, in a world that seemed impossibly distant now. But that had been years ago, and memory had dimmed the reality of what it actually tasted like. She took a sip, and her breath caught. The chocolate was rich and real, nothing like the thin powder and water mixture she remembered from wartime Germany. The milk was cold, impossibly cold in this desert heat, cold in a way that felt like luxury. The sweetness was perfect, not cloying, just enough to balance the chocolate's depth. Liesel drank half the glass in one long pull, and stopped and looked at the remaining liquid with something approaching reverence. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "This is not possible." "What's not possible?" Betty asked gently. "This. All of this." Liesel gestured at the brownies and milk. "We are prisoners. We are Germans. We fought against you. Why would you give us this? Why would you waste this abundance on us?" "It's not a waste," Betty replied. "You're people who are hungry and tired and far from home. The food is here. I can make it. Why wouldn't I share it?" Liesel translated this for the others, and their response was tears. Not all at once, not everyone simultaneously, but gradually the tears came. Anna wept quietly while eating her brownie, tears running down her cheeks while she chewed. Greta's eyes filled, but she blinked rapidly, trying to maintain control even as her chin trembled. Young Liesel stopped trying to translate and just cried, clutching her glass of chocolate milk like it was something precious beyond measure. The oldest of the women, Frau Kessler at 41, sobbed openly. She had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, had been captured while trying to evacuate wounded soldiers from an overrun field hospital, had believed that captivity would mean death or something close to it. Instead, she was drinking cold chocolate milk and tasting brownies and confronting the reality that her enemies were showing her more kindness than her own leadership had managed in years. Betty stood watching these women cry, and she felt her own eyes burn. She had lost her husband to war, had 3 sons in danger, had every reason to hate Germans. But seeing these women break down over brownies and chocolate, milk, seeing how thoroughly propaganda had trained them to expect cruelty, seeing the relief and confusion and overwhelming gratitude that simple food could generate, it made her understand something important about the nature of the war and what it had done to people on all sides. The women didn't speak much for the rest of the afternoon. They finished their brownies and chocolate milk in near silence, each processing what had happened in her own way. Lieutenant Walsh, who had watched the entire scene from the mess hall doorway, made notes for her report that would eventually reach Colonel Harrison's desk. That evening, after the women returned to their barracks for the night, they gathered in a circle on the floor and talked. Liesel translated as needed, facilitating a conversation that ranged across topics they had been avoiding since capture. "The propaganda was lies," Anna said, her voice still thick from crying. "All of it. They told us Americans were weak, that they had no resources, that they would treat prisoners with cruelty. But that woman, Betty, she baked for us. She made chocolate milk with real milk and real chocolate and gave it to us for free. That's not weakness. That's not scarcity. That's not cruelty. It's propaganda on their side, Greta argued, though her voice lacked conviction. They want us to think they're strong and generous, so we'll be compliant prisoners. If it's propaganda, it's the most effective kind, Liesel replied. Because it's true. The brownies were real. The chocolate milk was real. The kindness was real. You can't fake that. You can't manufacture the way that woman looked at us, like we were people rather than enemies. Frau Kessler spoke quietly. My husband believed everything the regime told him. He believed we were fighting for something righteous, that our enemies were evil, that our cause was just. He died believing those things. But if they lied about Americans, what else did they lie about? What did my husband die for? The question hung in the air, too heavy to answer, too important to ignore. These women had served the regime in various capacities, had believed to varying degrees in its mission and promises. The brownies and chocolate milk had cracked open something fundamental. If the propaganda about American weakness and cruelty was false, then what else might be false? Over the following weeks, Betty made it her mission to provide the German women with experiences that contradicted propaganda. She baked cookies and shared them freely. She made apple pie from local fruit and served it warm with real cream. She created meals that showcased American abundance without being wasteful, demonstrating that the country could feed its prisoners well while also feeding its own population and military. But more importantly, she talked with the women. Her German was minimal, their English mostly poor except for Liesel. But communication happened anyway through gestures and smiles and the universal language of someone who cared about whether you had enough to eat. Betty told them about her husband, about receiving the telegram that destroyed her world, about her sons serving overseas. She showed them photographs, her boys in uniform, her husband in his navy dress whites, family pictures from before the war when everyone looked happy and whole. I have every reason to hate Germans, Betty said one afternoon through Liesel's translation. Your country's leadership allied with the people who took my husband from me. Your military is fighting against my sons right now. But hating you won't bring him back. It won't keep my boys safer. It will just make me bitter and make your captivity harder than it needs to be. How can you separate us from our leadership? Anna asked. We served the regime. We believed what they told us. We are complicit in what Germany did. Maybe, Betty acknowledged. But you're also people who are shaped by circumstances beyond your control, who believed what you are taught, because questioning was dangerous or impossible, who are now in a position to learn different truths. Hating you for that would be like hating my sons for fighting. They redoing what they think is right, what they were trained to do, and I can't blame them for that, even when I wish none of it was necessary. The brownies and chocolate milk became a turning point, not just in the women's treatment, but in their understanding. If Americans could show such kindness to prisoners, if the country possessed such abundance that they could afford to bake brownies for captive enemies, then what else had propaganda gotten wrong? Lieutenant Walsh noticed the change and encouraged it. She arranged for the women to attend English classes, arguing that better communication would make their internment easier to manage. She brought in books and magazines from the camp library, approved by censors, but still offering windows into American society and values. The women absorbed these lessons with the intensity of people who had discovered their education had been incomplete or actively false. They read about American government, about democratic systems where power was distributed and checked rather than concentrated in single leaders. They learned about civil rights debates, about the mésages and strength of a society that allowed open disagreement with government policy. Greta, the nurse, was particularly struck by articles about American medicine. She had been taught that American healthcare was inferior, available only to the wealthy, that the country lacked the organization and expertise that made German medicine superior. But the reality she encountered in camp, the medical care available even to prisoners, the equipment and supplies that seemed abundant rather than scarce contradicted those teachings completely. I was taught American doctors were poorly trained, she confessed to Corporal Susan Chun, the camp's medical officer, during a routine health inspection. That American medicine was primitive compared to German expertise. But the supplies here, the equipment, the protocols, everything, is as good or better than what we had in military hospitals. Chun smiled slightly. Propaganda lies on both sides. We were taught Germans were monsters. Turns out most of you are just people who got caught up in something terrible. Amazing what you learn when you actually meet the people you're supposed to hate. As autumn arrived and the desert heat finally broke into something approaching comfortable, the women began writing letters home. Mail was heavily censored, carefully monitored for any content that might compromise security. But personal letters describing conditions and treatment were generally allowed. Anna wrote to her mother in Bavaria, "I am prisoner in America, in a place called New Mexico. The desert is unlike anything I imagined, so vast and empty and strange. But we are treated well here, Mother. Better than I expected, better than propaganda promised. They give us good food, warm clothing, medical care. An American woman named Betty bakes for us, makes brownies and cakes and cookies. She lost her husband in this war, but still shows us kindness. I don't understand it fully, but I am grateful for it. When I come home, and I believe I will come home eventually, I will tell you that not everything we were taught was true. Some of it was lies, and knowing that changes everything." Liesel wrote to a friend in Hamburg, "You asked in your last letter what captivity is like, whether they treat us harshly. I can tell you honestly, they treat us like human beings. We work, yes, but no harder than we worked in service. We eat regularly, and the food is adequate and sometimes quite good. There is a cook here who makes brownies that would be impossible to produce in Germany, now real chocolate, real butter, no substitutions or rationing. When I first tasted them, I cried because I realized how thoroughly we had been lied to about American scarcity. They have abundance, and they share it even with prisoners. I don't know what this means for Germany's future, but it suggests our leadership's promises about winning through attrition were based on false assumptions." Frau Kessler wrote to her daughter, "I miss you every day and think about you constantly. Camp life is difficult because it means I am separated from you, not because the Americans treat us poorly. I want to tell you something important. When this war ends, when Germany must reckon with what happened, I want you to remember that our enemies were capable of mercy. They did not have to treat us well. They could have been cruel and justified that cruelty by pointing to what our country did. Instead, they chose kindness. Remember that when you hear people talking about revenge or hatred, remember that even in war, some people choose differently. In late November, Betty proposed something ambitious to Lieutenant Walsh and Colonel Harrison. She wanted to include the German women in the camp as Thanksgiving celebration, not as segregated prisoners eating separately, but as actual participants in the meal, alongside guards and administrative staff. Colonel Harrison initially refused. That violates every protocol about prisoner separation and security. With respect, sir, it violates outdated protocols that don't serve any real purpose, Walsh argued. These women aren't security risks. They're cooperative, they've caused no problems, and including them in Thanksgiving would reinforce the lessons they're learning about American values. The men's compound will complain about unequal treatment. Then, extend the same courtesy to the cooperative male prisoners, Walsh suggested. But don't deny these women this experience just because it's non-standard. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking with standard procedure. Harrison considered this for 2 days before finally approving a modified version. The German women could attend the Thanksgiving meal, but in a separate section of the mess hall, with additional guards present and strict rules about interaction. Betty had other plans. Once everyone was seated and eating, she made sure to circulate through the entire hall, chatting with guards and prisoners alike, blurring the lines that Harrison's compromise had tried to maintain. Other staff followed her lead, and soon the meal became less about maintaining separation and more about the shared experience of eating good food together. The women were overwhelmed by the abundance. Turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce, and potatoes, and pie, so much pie. Pumpkin and apple and pecan, served with whipped cream that Betty had beaten by hand. The meal was excessive by any standard, demonstrating American abundance in ways that made their own wartime deprivation painful to recall. "This is what they can afford to give prisoners," Greta whispered to Anna in German. "Imagine what their civilians eat. Imagine what their soldiers have in the field. We were told they were starving, that their resources were depleted, that they couldn't sustain the war effort. But this," she gestured at the laden table, "this is not a country running out of anything." In December, as the camp prepared for Christmas, Betty made one final gesture that would cement her relationship with the German women. She spent weeks preparing a special gift, a recipe book, handwritten, containing all the recipes she had shared with them. Brownies and chocolate milk, but also cookies and pies and cakes, all documented with careful instructions and ingredient lists. On Christmas Eve, she presented the book to the women during their evening meal. "For when you go home," she explained through Liesel's translation. "So you can remember this time, and so you can share these tastes with your families someday." The women passed the recipe book around, each reading entries, some touching the pages as if they were something precious. Inside the front cover, Betty had written a message. "To the women of Barracks C, you came here as prisoners and enemies. You're leaving as people I came to care about. These recipes represent American abundance and American kindness, but they're also just good food that makes people happy. When you return to Germany, when you rebuild your lives and your country, remember that food can be a bridge between people. Remember that even enemies can choose to see each other's humanity. Remember that brownies and chocolate milk can change the world one small moment at a time." With affection, Betty Morrison. Liesel read this aloud in German, her voice breaking multiple times. When she finished, the women sat in silence for a long moment. Then Frau Kessler stood and approached Betty with arms extended. The two women hugged prisoner and guard, German and American, enemy and friend, while others watched with eyes that had long since stopped staying dry during these moments. "Thank you," Frau Kessler said in careful English. "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for the brownies and chocolate milk and everything they represented." The women left Camp Lordsburg at different times over the following 18 months as repatriation was organized. They returned to a Germany that was destroyed and occupied, divided and struggling to understand what it had become. But they carried with them the lessons learned in a New Mexican desert camp, lessons taught through brownies and chocolate milk, and one American cook who refused to let hatred define her response to captive enemies. Anna returned to Bavaria and became a teacher, eventually specializing in English and American studies. She taught her students about democracy and civil society and the importance of questioning propaganda. She kept Betty's recipe book and made brownies for her classes every December, telling them the story of an American cook who baked for German prisoners and taught them that enemies were not absolute categories. Greta worked in hospitals in occupied Germany and in the Federal Republic that eventually emerged. She collaborated with American medical personnel, bringing together German technical expertise and American resources in ways that benefited both. She spoke often about lessons learned in captivity, that abundance shared created more value than abundance hoarded. That kindness was not weakness, that propaganda simplifications dissolved when confronted with individual humans behaving compassionately. Liesel became a translator and interpreter, facilitating communication between German and American organizations as the two former enemies became allies. She credited her time in Camp Lordsburg with teaching her that language was just the surface of communication, that deeper understanding came from shared experiences like eating brownies and drinking chocolate milk together. They all stayed in touch with Betty, who lived until 1982 and maintained correspondence with the women she had fed in the desert. When Betty died, 6 of the surviving German women traveled to her funeral in Boston, standing in the back of the church during the service and crying for the woman who had taught them that humanity could survive even total war. The story of German women POWs trying brownies and chocolate milk might seem trivial against the backdrop of World War II as massive destruction, but it represents something crucial about the nature of propaganda and its dissolution, about the power of small kindnesses to reshape understanding, about food as a vehicle for communication beyond language. The women arrived at Camp Lordsburg carrying beliefs constructed by years of propaganda. They had been taught that Americans were weak and cruel, that the country lacked resources, that defeat would mean suffering. Every aspect of their training and education supported these beliefs until they became indistinguishable from truth. Then Betty Morrison baked brownies and made chocolate milk, and those beliefs encountered reality. The brownies were real chocolate and butter, and care made manifest in perfect squares. The chocolate milk was cold and sweet and abundant. The kindness was genuine, offered without expectation of return. And those realities could not coexist with propaganda's lies. The crying that followed wasn't weakness or manipulation. It was the sound of worldviews collapsing, of carefully constructed beliefs meeting evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. If Americans could afford to bake brownies for prisoners, they weren't weak or resource depleted. If an American cook would make chocolate milk for enemy captives, Americans weren't uniformly cruel. If small kindnesses happened regularly rather than rarely, then everything propaganda had promised was suspect. Betty's motivation was both simple and profound. She baked because she was a cook who believed food could heal. She shared because she understood that hatred accomplished nothing productive. She persisted in kindness despite losing her husband to war because she recognized that these German women were not the enemy in any meaningful sense. They were people caught up in forces beyond their control, people who deserved basic human decency, regardless of what government they had served. The impact rippled outward in ways Betty never fully recognized. The women she fed went home and taught different lessons than propaganda had provided. They raised children who understood that enemies were not absolute, that peoples could reconcile, that small kindnesses mattered more than grand gestures. They became bridges between former enemies, facilitating understanding that helped transform post-war Germany from defeated enemy to democratic ally. Decades later, when historians studied the repatriation of German POWs and their role in post-war reconstruction, they noted patterns that seemed almost miraculous. Prisoners who had been treated well in American camps were significantly more likely to support democratic reforms, to oppose extremist movements, to work toward reconciliation rather than revenge. The women of Camp Lordsburg were part of that pattern. They returned home carrying not just recipes, but philosophies learned through brownies and chocolate milk, that abundance was meant to be shared, that kindness was strength rather than weakness, that humanity transcended nationality when people chose to see each other as individuals rather than categories. Anna's students, taught to question propaganda and recognize manipulation, became journalists and teachers and activists who shaped German democracy. Greta's medical collaborations helped establish healthcare systems that balanced German precision with American pragmatism. Liesel's translations facilitated cultural exchanges that rebuilt bridges war had tried to destroy. And somewhere in Bavaria, in a kitchen that had been rebuilt from wartime rubble, one of Anna's granddaughters baked brownies using Betty Morrison's recipe, sharing them with friends from America who were visiting Germany, continuing a tradition of connection that had begun with prisoners and chocolate milk in a New Mexican desert. The brownies still tasted like abundance. The chocolate milk still represented kindness. And the lesson remained the same, that even in war's worst moments, even between enemies, even when propaganda promised only cruelty, humanity could persist if people chose it, one small gesture of sweetness at a time.